Okay, so here we go. We're talking about succession today. Okay. Now, when you hear the word succession, you probably think of success versus failure, winning versus losing. But there's actually a second way to use that same word. That same word actually also means to take the place of. So think of it like a king. If you're a king and you have a son who's the prince, when you die, the prince is going to become the new king, right? So the prince is what's called your successor. So a successor is the person who takes the place of the first person. Okay. So the prince is going to succeed the king when the king is gone. So that's another way to use that word. Just think of it as taking the place of. Okay. So what we're talking about today is ecological succession. And ecological means like the ecosystems, right? So in ecosystems, we have old species that die out and new species take their place. That's called succession. And there's two types of succession that we are going to talk about today, which is primary succession and secondary succession. Okay, so primary succession is just what it sounds like. Primary means first, and secondary means second. So in the major difference between primary and secondary is that in primary, we go from nothing to something. In other words, it's a place where there are no living things, and then some living things move in and start to live in a place where there was nothing living before it. Okay, that's primary, nothing to something. And in secondary, we start with something, but something new comes in and takes the place of the old something that was there before. That's secondary succession. So an example you might be familiar with is, imagine a forest, and that forest burns down, and after the forest burns down, new things come in and start to grow where the old forest used to be. So we have new things taking the place of old things. That would be secondary succession. Okay, but let's go back and talk about primary first. So if you rewind far enough back into Earth's history, Earth was nothing but a barren rock. No life on it, no plants, no nothing. But how did we go from barren rock to jungles and rainforests? How did that happen? Well, so it all happened because there's a special plant. It's not really a plant, it's kind of a plant, but it's a producer. It lives off of sunlight and water, basically. It's called a lichen. Okay, have you guys ever heard of a lichen? Well, I'm going to show you a picture. Okay. So these are lichens. These are lichens growing on rocks. So lichens are like these scaly things, and you've probably seen them growing on the sides of trees, like on a tree bark on the sides of trees, these little scaly things. They're kind of green and mossy looking. Those are lichens. So lichens have the special ability to actually grow on rocks as long as the rocks stay just a little bit wet, either from rain or if they're near the ocean and water just kind of sprays on them from the ocean. Lichens can grow on there. And lichens over time can actually break rock down very slowly with their tiny little roots. They can break rock down into a smaller and smaller pieces until it becomes a powder. So lichens can turn rock into soil. So over a long period of time, these lichens can form a thin layer of soil on top of the rock. And once you have enough soil, which you don't need very much, but once you have enough, you can start to grow things that are a little bit larger, like mosses. Okay, so mosses can grow on top of the newly formed soil, which is on top of the original rock layer that the lichens turned into soil. Do you understand? All right. Now, these mosses are what we call native species. A native species is a species that was there originally. They were the first ones there. So these mosses are what we call the native species. But over time, these mosses will grow and they'll die. And then they'll reproduce and the new ones will grow and they'll die. But every time a generation of mosses dies, they fall onto the ground, and plants, when they decompose, they become part of the soil. So over a long period of time, all these dead mosses will start to pile up, and they will decompose and break down into nutrients that will mix into the thin soil layer that was already there, and they will add to the soil. And the soil will become thicker, and it will have more nutrients because all those dead plants add nutrients into the soil. So over a long period of time, the soil becomes thicker and more nutrient dense. So that later on, more things that are larger can come in and grow where they were not before. So now that's primary succession, okay? We went from bare rock to mosses, the native species. Now, those native species, they die, they add to the soil layer, and now you have a nice thick layer of decomposed plants on top of the soil, on top of the rock that we started with. So now that we have this, other things like grass seeds can blow in from the wind, and they can blow in and land on this layer of decomposed plants and soil, and they can start to grow. So grasses will take over, and you won't even see moss anymore. Like it used to be just moss. That's all it used to be. But then once the grasses come in, they start growing, and what they do is they block the sunlight because grass is taller. So because grass is taller, it blocks the sunlight from everything that's below it, and all the moss eventually dies out until there's no more moss and it's all grass. So now the grass has taken the place of the moss. It has succeeded the moss. This is succession. This is secondary succession. Okay. So the grass is what we call a non-native species because it was mosses that were native, and now the grasses came in. These non-native grasses blew in from somewhere else and started growing and took over. But these grasses and shrubs will start to grow over time. But as the shrubs grow, what do shrubs do? Well, they grow taller than the grass, right? And what they do is they cast a shadow. Let me make this black, just to makes more sense if it's a shadow. They cast a shadow onto the ground around it, and they block the sunlight from all the grass that's trying to grow around it, right? Shadow, shadow. So you get rid of all the grass, and now you just have shrubs. And over more time, dead grass plus shrubs dying, what do? They die and they decompose and they add to the soil some more. So over a longer period of time, the soil gets even thicker and even more nutrient dense, right? Until it gets so thick and nutrient dense that you can actually have stuff like big, tall trees grow. And when big, tall trees grow, what do? They cast a bigger shadow. They block more sunlight. So they cast this big old shadow that blocks out the light for all the shrubs. And now the shrubs are gone. And the trees have taken the place of the shrubs. And what's that called? Succession, right? So now the trees have succeeded the shrubs. And that's how you end up with forests. Okay. So we've had several rounds of succession. We started with bare rock. Lichens turned the rock into a thin layer of soil, which allowed mosses to start to grow. The thicker they got, the more they died. They built up a layer of nice nutrients on top of the soil, so larger things like grass could come in. And so they started to grow, and then bushes started to grow, and then trees started to grow. And now we have a forest from where we used to have just bare rock. And that's how we go from rock to forest, okay? Through these natural cycles of succession. And that's it.